In a world full of noise, clarity is power. Stay informed, stay aware, stay top of mind. This is Top of Mind, the Dr. Patrick Slowinski Show.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Top of Mind podcast. I'm really excited to have you with us, and we've been gaining some great traction lately. More listeners, new followers, and we're now officially on Spotify, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Telegram. Starting now, we're also rolling out video, so if you're watching on YouTube, you'll get the full experience. Thanks for being the part of the journey, and without further ado, I'll pass it over to Dr. Patrick Slowinski to introduce our next great guest.
All right. Well, thank you, Victor. And kudos to you for all the energy and time you've been putting into the show. Clearly, it is respected and appreciated. So with me is my friend Simon Hankinson, a senior research fellow in Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation. But I know him from being, like me, a recovering diplomat. And he was a United States Foreign Service officer for over 20 years. Some of the places that Simon had the ability to go to and work into, or the opportunity, were in India, Fiji, Ghana, Slovakia, Togo, of course, like all of us back here in Washington, D.C., and then Marseille and Nairobi, French speaker, a prolific writer. Simon, you have written so much, and I'm just glad we have you over at the Heritage Foundation, but I'm also glad that we have you at the Ben Franklin Fellowship, which I'm also a member of, and we can talk about that at the end of the show. But with that, Simon, I'll let you add anything that I missed from the bio. I know you got your law degree in London, I believe. And so I want to hear a little bit about that, and also what you've been working on lately. I know you write a lot, and I think you have a new book coming out.
Well, thanks, Patrick, for having me on the show, and thanks for that introduction. I always prefer the short bio because, us old guys, we have long, boring bios. But
that's true.
Yeah, I've been around the block a little bit. I've had 24 jobs at last count. The shortest was delivering pizza for 3 hours in Colorado, and the longest was 23 years in the Foreign Service. And I've done construction and waited tables and driven a taxi and done a bunch of different things in a bunch of different places. And very happy, as you say, writing up a storm at the Heritage Foundation on immigration, border security, and sometimes foreign policy and diplomacy, and the State Department, the institution we both worked at, and I think both have a lot of affection for, but which needs some rescuing from its leftward lurch.
Oh, I would agree with that. And we're going to get to our beloved State Department in a minute. But I would be remiss if I did not have your thoughts on the, I think, historical last couple of weeks the president has had in foreign affairs, foreign policy, deal making, peace. I mean, developing plans for actual potentially durable peace in the Middle East. I couldn't stop watching the TV. I mean, it was interesting because we had a new pope coming in, and that he was rightly taking a lot of attention. But man, President Trump was out there in the Middle East. And when he said that sanctions were not going to be on Syria temporarily, we'll see how things go. There was a caveat there. I mean, the energy he has, you and I have talked a little bit offline, and you mentioned that, and I think your description was apropos. It's historical. So I want to get your thoughts on that as we kick off the show.
Yeah. One thing that I really admire about the Trump foreign policy approach is that he's not afraid to take risks and to break rules and to do things differently. And I think we've gotten mired in a sort of repeating the same ideas over and over again, hoping that this time it'll be different for so long in the Middle East in particular. But not just that, with Ukraine, with other intractable problems where it's become, a political left-right issue, whether or not we support Ukraine. That's not the issue. Everybody supports Ukraine. No one wants Putin to win. It's more a question of, we went through Vietnam. We went through Korea. We've done this before. We've had intractable problems that have to be solved one way or another, either by a stalemate like Korea or by one side winning, unfortunately, the wrong side in Vietnam. And intelligent people ought to be able to debate these things without being considered, fascists or communists or, epithets because they have a different view from other people. And I don't mean to pick on former President Biden. I don't. That's not my style, just to bash him for the sake of it. But honestly, when he traveled, most of us were probably thinking, I really hope he doesn't trip and fall.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope he gets through the speech. I hope he doesn't say or do anything embarrassing. When Trump is out there, you're thinking maybe he's gonna be the guy who figures out a way to make this work. To get the Israelis and the Saudis to be on full diplomatic relations, to open up the Middle East to trade and commerce in a way that's never been done before. So I don't know if he'll succeed, but he's certainly trying. He's certainly doing things in a different way. And with Syria, look, nobody thinks that this new government is somehow, a paragon of virtue, that these are just wonderful people who came out of the mountains to take over the country and they're going to run it as a utopian paradise. No, these guys have awful backgrounds. They are connected with some very dodgy and unpleasant people, and they have very likely blood on their hands, individually and collectively. The question is, what's the alternative? And can they be incentivized to behave in a more civilized manner in future? Time will tell. But just writing them off from the get-go puts us right back where we were a couple of years ago, which was a pretty terrible place when it comes to Syria.
Yeah, and Syria, as you mentioned, is just one of them I'm thinking. And of course, we're thinking about Ukraine. I actually served there. Our producer, Victor, is Ukrainian. I have a lot of love for that part of the world. I've served in Russia and Poland. Polish elections going on tomorrow. Big deal over there. I don't want to take too much of your time on Polish elections because, of course, someone with my last name, I'm pretty I'm pretty wired into what's going on and what that means if Poland were to take an actual step back towards the left. I hope they don't, but it is their choice, and they are going to decide. In terms of other issues that the president has done, I noticed something really interesting. I think the phrase that comes to me is a prophet is never accepted in his homeland. You see this growing support for President Trump outside of the United States, but at home we still are extremely bifurcated. We're extremely tribal, and anything that President Trump does for anyone who doesn't like him, it's the worst thing ever. There's no middle ground. There's no objectivity for what he's actually doing generally. I've seen a little bit when it comes to tariffs now that people are saying, well, okay, he got lucky. But they always dismiss it. That's one thing with how the media treats him. The thing that I wanted to ask you about today, Simon, is the lawfare that's continuing. Federal judges, district judges, interesting decisions by the Supreme Court that are at least postponing some of President Trump's policies that, frankly, he got elected on, ending immigration, sending the bad guys home immediately. And now we're taking a pause and looking at that and making sure that criminals who entered our country illegally, who had a criminal record from their home country and probably added to it here in the United States since he's been here, they have to make sure they get a whole court case or whatever it may be. So we're kind of in upside down land with that. But I guess my question is, where do you see this inertia that President Trump has and this momentum getting just stifled by the courts, or do you think there are ways to work around it?
I think this is just a feature of our times, unfortunately, that president of Party A wants to do something, has an agenda. The activists of Party B will be out there with their lawsuits on day one. We did see lawsuits against President Biden for some of the, frankly, outrageous and illegal things he did. I mean, the parole was my absolute worst nightmare, where he let in 1.5 roughly million people, 30,000 a month from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. That's 3 socialist enemies of the United States in one failed state, pretty much. We knew nothing about these people. We had no verified background information, name, date of birth, criminal history, none of it. He let them in. Another 1,450 a day let in under the CBP-1 parole. To me, that was an outrage. And then the catch and release at the border, where Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time, said, when he was asked in December of 2023, we're releasing over 85% of the people caught at the border. And essentially, they hoped that they would stay forever. That's what they wanted. It was an open borders philosophy. I get some slack for saying that sometimes, some stick for saying it, but it's true. They wanted everyone to come in because they wanted them to claim asylum, or they thought they had a right to, even though they knew that most of them wouldn't qualify or shouldn't qualify because they're economic migrants and they're here for a job. So, after 4 years of that, President Trump is trying to undo all of those policies, and he did very successfully do that. Within basically a month, we went from over 100,000, sometimes up to 373,000 was the worst ever month in U.S. history, illegal aliens encountered at our ports of entry or between ports of entry on the border. And it went down to like 8,000. I mean, it was I think the total number is around 28,000. The southwest border is like 10,000.
Yeah, it's 99% closed.
99% down. And all this time we were told, we need more laws, we need more money, we have to pass this amazing Senate bill, which was a total dog. And none of it was true. It was all doable by executive action. It was simply that President Biden, or more likely the far left of his party that was running the show on immigration, decided that they wanted basically open borders and almost zero law enforcement. But predictably, we knew the ACLU, which I joke, but at one point they were the defenders of free speech for Americans, famously defending Nazis in Illinois, and making the point that even Nazis have the right to free speech unless they, advocate for people committing crimes. And now, as far as I can tell, they do illegal immigrant rights and transgender issues. That's like the two things that they seem to litigate. Maybe they still do some free speech on the side. And they were ready to go. So any activist group would help an illegal immigrant in a particular situation sue the government, sue the Department of Homeland Security with the ACLU and other organizations helping out. And so we've seen a rash of suits. But I think one thing that's interesting about Trump's approach this time is in 2017, I don't think they knew as much about these issues. I was working a little bit on those back at the State Department. The team just wasn't as cohesive as they are now and as educated, frankly, on the issues. They learned a hell of a lot in those 4 years. They banged their heads against a bunch of brick walls, got a lot of injuries, but this time they came armed for bear. And I think what they did is they did a scatter shot, let's do everything all at once and see what works. So the Alien Enemies Act, nobody ever thought of doing that before. It's a 1798 law. It's still on the books. And the president said, yes, I declare that there is an invasion or a predatory incursion or whatever the specific language is. Let's see if it works. And they deported some pretty bad dudes from Venezuela to El Salvador, where the president has set up this incredible facility basically to clean his country up and offered space to the United States. And then he canceled parole for people who shouldn't have gotten in the first place. He's going to actually take temporary protected status seriously, because if you read the law, it's right there in the name. It is a temporary protected status. Let's say you're over here from whatever country, there's an earthquake and half the country's in ruins and it takes them a while to rebuild. They don't want everybody to have to go back, right away because the country can't absorb them, food shortages, whatever. That was sort of the thinking behind it as far as I can remember. But we've had people from El Salvador, there's like 20,000 people that have been here since they had an earthquake in like 1998.
Exactly.
And it's almost seen now as a right. It's just like every 18 months it gets renewed forever. That's not what it's supposed to be. The immigration law is written by Congress with a purpose in mind, just like parole. And when that purpose is abused, you need to put the train back on the rails. And I think that's what Trump is doing. So he is being sued on the Alien Enemies Act. He's being sued on the parole thing. He's being sued on basically there are people who they call themselves abolitionists. They don't believe in, and that's not abolition of slavery. That happened 150 plus years ago. They believe in abolishing the criminal justice system. They do not want anyone to be incarcerated for any reason. And the extreme version of this is they want to get rid of the courts altogether, and we just have like a big kumbaya circle and talk to people and they'll stop being criminals, which anyone who has read one book or even an article on criminology knows is not the way things work. Most crimes committed by a very small number of people who commit an awful lot of crimes, rather than just everybody does one crime in their life. So they're ready with the lawsuits, and it's just going to be a question of how long it takes to get these sorted out. But one good thing that's going to come out of it is that the Supreme Court is going to be able to lay down some lines so that next time we know where they are. For example, these national injunctions, nationwide injunctions, where a district judge sitting in Washington, D.C., or in California or in Boston can say that the president cannot carry out a national policy to millions of people based on like a lawsuit with 3 or 4 people. Now, legal scholars obviously they disagree on everything, otherwise they wouldn't be making money as lawyers. But
Exactly.
the ones that I most respect are making the case, I think, very convincingly that this is an aberration. If you look at the 20th century, I think there was a total of about 29 nationwide injunctions. We've had over 70 already in the 21st century, and 65 of them were against Trump. So this is pretty clearly political action. Maybe these judges don't think of themselves as acting politically, but it is awfully coincidental that in almost every case of a nationwide injunction against Trump, it is in Democrat-run district.
Exactly.
And it's a judge appointed by Obama or Biden or a Democratic president. So unfortunately, we all want to believe that judges are superhuman and they're able to just look at the Constitution and the law and implement it and decide according to the law. And I hope for the most part they do. But when it comes to these very high-profile cases, it does seem as if politics has bled into the judiciary to some degree.
Couple things that I've been thinking about as you've been speaking, and thank you. And our listeners should know that you have a vast wealth of experience in the law and also consular affairs. So you know this stuff. You know the Immigration and Naturalization Act really well. So we appreciate that. As somebody who is a lifelong student and teacher of psychology, I often think of the cognitive dissonance, right, between the liberals and the Republicans on these issues, right? We're not the ones throwing all the lawsuits. I mean, we could have gone to red states, got these judges to go ahead and make all these cases up and see where they would go with the idea of doing political harm to the Bidens and to his administration. We didn't do that. And a lot of to the most pretty much we did.
I would say in scale,
we did not.
Conservatives did it less than progressives, but
it's real. What my point is that it's really not our nature. And if I was on the Hill for a little bit, was chief of staff there. They don't really take prisoners, and I think one of the things we're seeing when anytime something that President Trump wants to get passed, that we've got these Republicans that come out, and yes, they have constituents and they have agendas, and but they talk about doing the right thing, right? Well, Democrats don't really care about that. They care about hierarchy. They don't really care about hypocrisy, and they certainly don't care about cognitive dissonance. They want the end results. And I think that we are at a crossroad of that. If we are going to be conservatives, are going to be sacrificing their, and I'll get to my point in a second, sacrificing their integrity to do the same things that their opponents are doing. I hope we don't, but. The judges are starting to scare a lot of Americans that they just don't seem to care anymore. You have the judge who was very happy to charge President Trump over $400 million for his Mar-a-Lago estimates of value and so forth. You have judges right and left who will do anything, and they're in blue states and they're protected. And my question is, it's pretty easy, I think, for conservatives looking in to say, well, this is mostly happening in blue states and it doesn't seem fair, but it's still happening. So how does it get stopped? What can we do as conservatives in this country to say, hey, wait a minute, we don't particularly like what's going on in our judicial system?
Yeah, and I think you've got to the core of a real problem for conservatives is that, at least in my understanding, my view of conservatism, it is we want to conserve that which is good, our traditions, our values, our history, the family, the country. And we do change. We accept progress. We accept advancements in civilization, but we want to be very sure before we make a move that we're doing the right thing. When we come to that wall in the middle of nowhere, we don't just rip it down because it's in our way. We ask, why is there a wall then? What is it doing?
Right.
And so but that's our sort of fundamental weakness in that we don't want to rip down the courts. We don't want to stuff the Supreme Court. We don't want to have a so-called living constitution where we just pretend that there's a magical right to abortion in this document when there just isn't. If you read it on its face, And so that does put us at a disadvantage. And to some degree, we have had to adapt. I have this theory of red ants and black ants. The black ants are the big ones that are kind of lumbering, and the red ants are much faster and they can sting. The black ants might be bigger and they might outnumber the red ants, but if the red ants are moving faster and they play dirtier and they have a sting, they're going to win. And Republicans can't be the black ants in this scenario. We've got to use the tools at our disposal, and we have to try to use the existing framework that we love, the Constitution and the laws, to prevent future Democratic administrations from doing things like opening the borders, paroling in millions of people, stuffing the Supreme Court. And it does seem much, much harder now because, look, you can like Trump or not like Trump. If you could step back from him as a human being and look at the cases against him. And I think liberals have a really hard time with this because it's so personal for them. They just cannot see him in other than, ad hominem terms that it's Trump derangement syndrome, they call it. But look at these cases. The only one to me that made any sort of legal sense was the one where there were classified documents found. You actually had Biden had documents, Trump had documents. And the only thing Trump didn't do that Biden did is, I guess, Biden's people called up and said, oh, whoops, where do you want him? And Trump's people didn't. They for whatever, they weren't rolling over right away. But other than that, there was no difference. And if they were treated very differently. They didn't prosecute Biden. Why? Because who investigated him and was, to me, he was a gentleman. That guy was very cool under fire when he was testifying before Congress. He said this guy would be seen as a sympathetic old man with a weak memory. And he wasn't saying that for political reasons. He was saying it because it was true. And we now all know it's true because we've seen him, and we know that he couldn't remember the most basic details about what happened last week, let alone last year, and he would not have been able to answer those questions in a court of law.
Right, exactly. And I'm thinking more about behavior, human behavior, because that's something I do all the time in my work, in my career. And I think it goes to ideologies. If we're talking about conservatives, we have, for many of us, Judeo-Christian value systems underneath. That is not something we could talk about in one show. It would take forever. But there is a historical system of values there. Over on the left, I see a lot of Marxist theory. I see a lot of Engels and I see Marx, of course, and I see all of them. And I see underneath at the Frankfurt School, and I see critical theory. And then the unfortunate byproduct of critical theory, which was CRT. And that is their base. So that's who we're fighting. That's what they believe. A godless kind of, or a different type of God, if you will, but not the one that we believe in and the one that's been encoded in our history and was the reason why our country was established. So I look at the ideologies, and that scares me a little bit more. I hope President Trump, among all of his successes, and he only has less than a 4-year term, and already. And remember, we both know how much time a president really has in office. It's not the full 4 years, so it's less than that. So you always have to be operating like it's less. I hope that he will also continue to take a look at our higher educational system. I think there's a real rot there, an ideological rot that has really infected our universities. I'm blessed enough to be at Liberty University. We don't even have tenure there on purpose. And we really have a free exchange. Yes, we talk about God and we bring other values into the conversation, but we don't stop talking about psychology or sociology or we have a medical school, right? So you can do both. You can include God, and then you can also be quite professionally successful in what you study. So I'm not buying that argument that all these universities can't change. But we need to look at that, because that ideology just gets passed down from generation to generation. And guess what? A lot of them become school teachers or school administrators. What do? They take it with them. And then and so you have this thing. And I know that President Trump gets it. I just don't know if we have enough time. And so I'm always praying that we get a little more time for another Republican to come in after President Trump. But we've got to tackle the root of the problem, which is the ideological infection across our country.
Yeah, they have an expression. They call it queering, whether it's history, the family. It means sort of destroying it because they don't like the norm. They don't like the cis hetero patriarchal, white supremacist, whatever you want to call it. Everything that always was in our history, they don't like. And the
Right.
problem with that is, well, there's a lot of problems with it, but the biggest problem is that if you tear down your house and then you build a nicer house, that's an achievement, that's an advancement. If you tear down a slum and you build a bunch of nice apartments, that's an improvement. But they can tear down and they don't know how to rebuild. I was just reading a good book about New College, Florida, which was supposed to be the elite sort of flagship campus of the University of Florida system.
Right.
And it was, queered, I put in quotation marks, meaning they took it down this left-wing path where all they did was gender studies and an obsession with race and an obsession with grievance. And they didn't teach anything that would give people jobs and that would encourage people to come to that school who actually wanted to get out of bed in the morning and go make a family or make America great again or even earn a living, it seems. So this place was losing money and it had a very low enrollment. And the DeSantis government in Florida appointed a board, Richard Corcoran, Chris Rufo, and others who turned it around. And they got enrollment up, they fixed the financial problems, and they are in the process of turning it back into a functional university. I don't know if that can be replicated. I think the Ivies are a lost cause. But for the left, if you're going to tear something down, if you're going to say, okay, the family is bad, mother, father, 2 kids, 5 kids, that's terrible. Okay, what's your proposal? Let's compare your proposal with our proposal. I think the saddest thing I've ever seen, one of my red pill moments where I realized I had to get off the horse, the train to nowhere, and pick a side and start speaking my mind and start writing, was this documentary on Netflix about different kinds of families. And I only ever saw one set of families. I didn't see the others. So maybe they had some, traditional and functional families. But this one was a man who wanted to be a woman and a woman who wanted to be a man. So they transitioned, like they cut pieces off and added pieces on, and they were taking various chemicals and whatever. So I understand that was their desire. But the episode that I saw was a very sad one where the male was attempting to breastfeed this baby, and the baby is screaming because, of course, the baby's not getting any nutrition, and the man who thinks he's a woman is upset because he's not able to produce milk and to feed this baby. And I thought to myself, we have here a functioning woman, or we did, and a functioning man who are a couple who presumably love each other and want to have a child. And, God or biology gave us a way to make that happen. And she has all the parts necessary to produce this child and feed this child. And he has all of the things necessary to help make that family flourish. And yet they're both utterly miserable because they destroyed the basic elements of what makes a family work. And it was just a really sad object lesson in what happens when you tear something down and you don't have anything to replace it with.
Well, listen, because we're both not intellectually corrupt, I will address, after you've made those statements, how some of my liberal friends who I love, and they pray for me and I pray for them, and we try to maintain good friendship. They see us, or conservatives in the Trump administration, and let's start with our beloved State Department, and USAID is coming in and just tearing it down. And what I mean by tearing down, getting rid of federal employees who haven't done anything wrong. And now they don't have jobs, and the USAID is completely gone. What do you say to that argument? Are we also part of the tearing down, but for different reasons, and are our reasons more justified than theirs?
Well, I don't think we're tearing down the institution of the State Department as a whole. We know that we need a diplomatic corps. We know that we need a State Department. I think what we're doing is we're radically reorganizing it because it got so bad that trying to do the nips and the tucks is just not going to do the job. Let's take the big picture. We're $38 trillion in the hole, and we're going in the hole a further $1.8 trillion a year. Now, I don't blame Democrats for all of that.
No.
I blame Republicans.
I don't
too.
either.
I don't think it's 50-50, but I think both sides contribute. Nobody wants to touch Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or any other entitlement. And look, any adult knows that sooner or later, we're either going to run out of money or we're going to have to re-examine those.
People are living longer. Thank God for that. Right. But if you live longer, there's more cost.
We lived to be 63 when the Roosevelt administration made all of those programs, and now we live to be 85. So, it's not that hard to do the math. And I think we were just, intellectually dishonest. But places like the State Department, when I've had meetings with other think tanks, and I'm always the only one. I'm the turd in the punch bowl, the only one that ever says we don't grow forever. We can't keep expanding. At some point, you've got really three choices, three options when you're in debt. You either spend less, so you have to cut, you borrow more, or you raise revenue, so you raise taxes. Well, let's be realistic. Is there any prospect that we're going to raise taxes meaningfully in America? Does either side want to do that? There might be Democrats who want to do that, but I don't think they have the votes. I don't think it's ever going to happen in the next few years. We've borrowed up to the hilt. There's a limit to how much we can borrow. We're paying interest now that's greater than our defense budget every year. And if it goes up 1 point, it is trillions of dollars that goes out the window. Okay, so what's the only thing left on the table? We have to cut. And I don't like to see anybody lose their job. Doesn't make me happy. I was at the State Department. I was a federal worker, and I respect the people who do their jobs. But when you restructure, you have to look and see, what are we doing? Does it need to be done? Can we do it more efficiently? And there are times when you do have to reduce the force. And you also have to do things like relocate people. We have all these people in Washington now that were here from generations before, when we had no telephones and no technology. We now have incredible technology. COVID had many evils, but one of the things we learned from it was that it is possible to do some, by no means all, jobs remotely. Well, why don't we take those jobs that can be done more efficiently from Washington to places like Kentucky or Kansas or Northern California, or wherever there are people who need jobs, and there's lower cost of living, there's more housing, there's better healthcare, and so on. So there are things that we can do that can make the State Department and other agencies function more efficiently. U.S. aid, I guess, was so far gone that there was just no other option than to roll it into the State Department. The tactics of how it was done, the speed. In retrospect, if we write a book about this in 10 years' time, or maybe we conclude it could have been done differently. But I think the speed was essential, because look what happened the first time around. When Trump was in office, we had Rex Tillerson. He's a good guy. He obviously was a good executive at his oil company, but he took an approach of let's do our research and carefully he was there for a year. Nothing happened. It was all planning and all strategizing, and they never actually carried out anything. And so no reforms took place. The deep state, the people who really do resist anything that any Republican ever tries to do, and there are some, they're not everybody, but it is a significant number of people in the federal government, they waited him out. They waited Trump out and just said, we'll just keep doing what we do, and they'll eventually blow away and give us another Democrat. So I think this time they were realistic. They said, look, most presidents in a second term lose. In a first term, they lose at the midterms, control of either the House or the Senate. That's pretty much what happens every time. Maybe we'll get lucky this time, but let's see what we can get done in 2 years and not wait. Because if you do the research first, then you're just going to end up perpetuating the problem forever.
And there's some great ideas coming out. I don't know. I'm not that connected in with the seventh floor of the State Department anymore, and I don't know what they know or what they're thinking about. But some of the great ideas that people are giving us are like, try to find ways that diplomats actually live outside of DC. Maybe they could do some training overseas instead of in DC, where that's really expensive to keep families in this area and pay for their lodging, pay for their miscellaneous and their food and other expenses. And you pay for them for up to a year or more sometimes when they're here doing training. Maybe that can be done while they're already at post. Some people don't like this, but maybe we need to review how many posts we have and how many people we have at a post. And those are big decisions that we have just kicked the can down for years. And even though I love the State Department, I love my friends just like you. We have lots of friends and colleagues that are still in the State Department, and we want them to be successful and happy. But I think if you're being honest about the situation, there's some waste there. And it's not just the State Department. It's a federal wide. And then, people who work in state government say it's the same thing for them. They could go into a real purge of waste, not of people per se, but of waste, and maybe save some of those jobs.
The two truths of my overseas service: I never met an ambassador who didn't want more staff, who didn't want a bigger embassy, more of everything. Same with domestic office directors and undersecretaries and so on. They all want to grow. They all want to expand. That's, their human tendency. And I also never had a single job that I was in where I didn't see people who had jobs that didn't need to be done. Some weren't pulling their weight, but there were good people trying to do their best to do a job that didn't need to be done. And I was kind of shocked at how much of our product is for us. We produce reports and cables that are read by a very small number of people sometimes and have absolutely no impact. And it's depressing when you have one of those jobs. But as a manager, as a taxpayer, you got to look at that and say, why, for example, do we produce the International Religious Freedom Report out of the Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a congressionally mandated body and produces a report. Then we also have the State Department's Trafficking in Persons Report, Human Rights Report, Religious Freedom Report. There's like 5 or 6 separate reports that essentially cover the same ground and could easily be combined into one. My story on this is when I was in India, I was in charge of organizing the India Human Rights Report. It was around 100 pages. I didn't write it all. I mean, I just edited and other people fed me the information. And I looked at this and I realized that people like to use the word utilize, which I've never liked. It means the same as use. It just, people think it sounds smart.
It's a synonym,
So I looked it up and it does mean exactly the same as use. Very subtle difference, in like definition number 5. So I went and I did a search and replace in this early word system. And I saved a whole page out of 100 by changing utilize to use. And I was very proud of myself. And so I sent the draft back to Washington, and you know exactly how the story ends. The editor back in Washington changed all the uses back to utilize. We added a page. That is a metaphor for how the State Department.
No, that's a very sad but true example of things. I'll just say this on the USAID front. I think it was an organization that at its heart has good people and their heart's in the right place. But I think it was easily manipulated and in a way that ended up costing us a lot of money. And that's the problem. And I think there are ways to do good international development through the State Department. I don't think we're just going to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater and say, no, we're never going to do foreign assistance again.
Look, so I don't think most Americans have a problem with PEPFAR, the president's program against AIDS, tuberculosis,
exactly.
Feeding people who are starving, helping out in natural disasters, helping farmers to be better farmers. There's some basic programs there that most people support, even if it costs us money. But the Palm Beach Freedom Institute did a report like 2 weeks ago listing all these. I mean, it was just, even to someone like me, and I wrote my own report about all of these ridiculous grants, the Washington Free Beacon. There are so many of these idiotic grants that any normal American is going to look at, and even the farthest left might go, really? We're doing that in Peru or in Ecuador or wherever? These were not programs that were making America safer, more prosperous, and free. And they weren't really making the countries that they were giving money to any better. They were left-wing obsessions that were wasting taxpayer dollars on programs that simply should not have been done. And also, in some cases, were actually counter to what a majority of Americans actually believe and support. And the worst, the most egregious were things like the gender ideology, which we are now in the process of sobering up from that nightmare, and I think going to draw back on how far we try to push kids into changing their bodies in pursuit of this chimera. But overseas, we were shoving it down the throats of traditional societies, religious societies, and I think losing ground in their eyes. They thought of us as sort of cultural imperialists with our, as you say, Marxist ideologies that we're trying to shove down their throats. And then even almost as bad as that were these information programs where we were paying foreign groups. And there was one in Britain that was then monitoring and trying to deplatform and demonetize Americans from speaking freely because they were conservative and they said things that they didn't like. Now it was those, I think, shocking examples that unfortunately overshadowed the good programs that we had, the sort of core programs that were about national values and exporting things that are almost universally agreed upon as good. And that resulted in USAID getting so far out on its skis that eventually it was almost shut down.
I think about families right now. There's a family that I know that fell in some kind of hard times with job uncertainty, and they have these high school kids that do this traveling sports, right? Apparently, that's super expensive. And so they had to tighten their belts. And guess what? The kid's not in the traveling sports. Is it painful? Is it unfortunate for the family? Yes. But their attitude has always been is that, our house needs to be in order financially. And if we have to make some cuts, they are painful. I think we've got, as a people, we only want good things and pleasant things to happen in our lives, and we don't want to feel any pain. I get that. That's a normal human reaction. But the reality is sometimes in order to make something better, we have to make some cuts. I wanted to just close up as we're getting to the end of our show today, and it's been fascinating. We're going to have you back on again. We've talked about a little bit about President Trump's successes, and I pray they continue. I think they will. He's got a good team. I think Americans are getting behind him on a lot of issues, even though the media is fighting him and coming up with skeptical polls, in my opinion. He's always going to have to fight that. He's Donald Trump. That's just what it is. I think he's got some momentum going now in foreign affairs, which is beautiful. I hope he can actually get peace. I mean, one of the reasons I even flirted with being a libertarian was because I didn't want to go to war, and I didn't want anyone I love to go to war. And if we have a president who's looking at ways so that we don't have to go to war, that's fantastic to me. What about, I know that conservatives come and say, so what can you do? Not all of us have time or the energy or want to start a podcast or write articles. You and I write articles quite a bit. There is an organization out there called the Ben Franklin Fellowship. It's been getting a little bit of attention in some areas for good and for bad. I want you, as one of the founding members of that organization, just tell us a little bit about it and why it's become an important force to getting the conservative voice on foreign affairs in particular out there.
Yeah, the fellowship started sort of separately in the minds of Phil Linderman, another retired Foreign Service officer, and myself when we were both still serving. And after we both retired, he wasn't able to get his chapter. He came up with the name, and he wasn't able to get it going fully, although he almost got there with approval from the State Department because of COVID, and then he retired. And I had come up with the idea it was about the time I was retiring that we really needed to have some kind of network, some kind of umbrella to let people who were not flaming leftists, I mean, I'm being blunt, know that they were not alone. That, if you supported traditional American values and you did not want to export rainbow ideology all over the world, and you wanted secure borders, you didn't believe in a universal right to migrate and so on, that was okay to say those things. We could have a discussion and a debate about Ukraine, about the Middle East, without calling each other names. And then Matt Boyce, as our third amigo here, the third musketeer, said, hey, you should talk to each other because you both have the same idea. So the three of us started this organization with very modest hopes. We figured maybe we get 3-4 retirees and then, have a couple meetings and just get some people around. And it's just blown up in a way that's very satisfying because there was clearly an untapped market for people, particularly mid-level and younger people coming into the Foreign Service who, they maybe grew up in a family where they were taught that America was a good place and that, yes, we had all kinds of issues in our history. I taught American history. I'm not blind to the bad things, but we're also uniquely cool. And we have a prosperous, free society and live with a freedom that is only imagined in most of the rest of the world. And they were upset by going to the State Department and feeling like they couldn't speak freely. The diversity, equity, and inclusion blob was sort of smothering free speech at the State Department. And of course, you can't talk politics at work. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying if you believed in a traditional family structure, if you wanted to get married and have kids and go to church on a Sunday, if you didn't think that all Republicans were automatically evil and that Donald Trump was Hitler, you had to be really quiet about it.
Or get reprogrammed or deprogrammed, whatever it may be.
Yeah, they actually you had to have a diversity statement in every single job interview once you got in. First of all, to get into the State Department and into the Foreign Service, but to get jobs once you're in, you had to say, it wasn't just like, tell us about your personal philosophy of management. And you could say, I treat people respectfully, I treat everybody equally, and I don't yell, and I reward good performance, and I punish bad performance. No. It was, how much do you love DEI? And show me the examples of when you used it in your career. And if you were to say, well, look, I believe in, small d, diversity, equity, and inclusion, sure, fairness, but I don't believe in racial discrimination or sex discrimination to achieve, equity, equal results, because that's not the way human beings are. That is considered wrong think, and you will find yourself not getting jobs, not getting promotions, not getting ahead. So we wanted to create this, I hate to say safe space, that sounds so campusy, but a forum for people to be able to have grown-up conversations the way they used to, 30 years ago. And I think we're able to do that, and we're getting a lot of people. There's a lot of, we get a few press queries, and I think people in the department think that somehow this is this, conspiracy sort of behind the
kind of cabal in the back.
Right. And it's like, I keep saying, our values, we have a website, we have 8 principles. They're right there. Read them and tell me which one you don't agree with. And please come to our events. We want to have an actual discussion. We're not going to tell you what to think. We're not going to tell you who to vote for. We're not going to say, what bill should be passed. We're just going to lay out some general ideas and have an open conversation. And we want to move on to in the next year. We've got a little grant money. We're applying for more. We're going to get out to campuses, to parts of the country that never send anyone to Washington. Now, this isn't about white or black or Hispanic. It's just there are parts of the country from California down to Texas and up to Maine where no one's ever heard of the Foreign Service. And even if they're smart kids, maybe nobody in their family, traveled, or they didn't go to college, they didn't read about foreign policy, they don't care about foreign policy. We wanted to show them that here's this thing out there, the State Department, they have a Foreign Service, and you, if you want to, could represent your country overseas, learn a language, and be part of this outfit. You don't have to go to Georgetown. You don't have to go to Yale. You don't have to be this color or that color. You just have to pass the exam, and we would love to have you. So we want to get out there and preach the word a little bit about how great this country is and how much fun it is to represent it overseas.
Well, excellent. I really appreciate it. And I, as a fairly new member, I see a lot of potential, a lot more interest coming in the benfranklinfellowship.org. And we will be sure to put that on our sites as well, and our LinkedIn and other places. I think producer Victor, you will take care of that. Simon, as we wrap up, you've got a book coming out. If you want to just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. It's hopefully going to be published July 4th. We picked that auspicious date. It's called The 10 Woke Commandments You Must Not Obey. And it's I want to think of it as we all have these conversations sometimes where we get tongue-tied because we know something's wrong, but we just don't have the fact or the number at our fingertips. Well, I want this to be like a 3-hour airplane read where if you have that conversation at Thanksgiving, you'll have a couple of points that you can cite and a couple of arguments to back up what you know in your gut is true.
Well, I really appreciate it. And Simon, I love working with you with the Ben Franklin Fellowship and just talking about these things. Thank you for coming on the show, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks for having me.